Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss a report in Bloomberg today which seems to show that Sunak's advisors have finally cottoned on to the notion that providing Reform UK with the oxygen of publicity isn't working out great for the Tories, and maybe he should stop it. Oh, but not until after next week. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I've said a few times that Sunak must have been mad to go ahead with his Rwanda plan, or any sort of focus on spurious arguments about asylum and immigration. Yes, the Tories have often profited from such rhetoric in the past, but only because they were the only serious show in town for that sort of talk. But now Reform UK are providing competition, and there's something unique about the challenge they pose to the Conservatives now. Because you could argue that UKIP provided this exact challenge beforehand, and of course they won a lot of votes in 2015, and you go, yeah, absolutely. But it wasn't a serious challenge to the Conservatives, and they should not have taken it as seriously as they did. In the Conservatives' favour, up until 2010, when UKIP were going, was the fact that they were an opposition party too. So they could position themselves as the credible anti-asylum and immigration party to attract votes to the Conservative Party, because people ultimately know, well, the Conservatives can actually form a government and put these measures into place. UKIP can't. They can just carp from the sidelines. Then after 2010, when the Conservatives were in power, so they could no longer dissociate themselves from perceived failures in the system because, well, they were in charge of that system, they could still benefit from Labour failing to provide a strong enough showing in the elections. But this year it's all different. They've got it from both sides. There's both an organised political party offering all the simple solutions to these spurious problems. You've got the Conservatives in power, they've been in power for 14 years, presiding over a situation that is a failure even by their own measure. And you have a Labour Party acting strategically. Basically, what I've been saying is that asylum and immigration are no longer a safe space for the Conservatives. They really need to reevaluate themselves in the here and now. Immigration asylum used to be a good thing for them to talk about, not anymore. I mean, when even the Labour leader chooses to ask questions about asylum in PMQs to a Conservative Prime Minister, that should tell you that asylum is now a weakness for the Tories. Sunak should have brushed it under the carpet and left well enough alone. That wouldn't have stopped Reform UK banging on about it, and it wouldn't have stopped some in the media banging on about it. But without the government having very much to say about it, they couldn't really have turned it into a major issue. It wouldn't have been on the front pages very much. Because what are they going to report on? The government are basically going, yeah, we're sorting it. That's what he should have just said. He should have said, we're sorting it. We're dealing with it. He should have dropped the performative rubbish and pursued effective but deeply boring solutions to deal with the issues which he inherited. He didn't. He thought he could use it to appease the far right in his party in just the same way Cameron did likewise with his Brexit referendum. And just like that appeasement broke Cameron, followed by the Conservative Party, now Sunak's making the same mistake. He has provided the oxygen of publicity to asylum and has not even bothered to counter the spurious arguments about it. So he's created himself a situation where he has to agree that a particular problem's a problem when it isn't, and he has to agree on certain solutions which he knows he cannot actually deliver in practice. He's gone along with Reform UK's agenda. I mean, in sport, they always say, do the opposite of what your opponent wants you to do. I keep saying politicians should take this to heart. If Sunak was as big a fan of sports as he often claims to be, surely he would have known enough not to have fallen in this trap. And yet he did fall into it. In fact, he seemed to jump into it. And it seems that even Sunak's advisors have come to this conclusion. Bloomberg are reporting that Sunak should get his Rwanda bill through the Commons next week and then focus on the economy. Ignore Nigel Farage. Ignore Reform UK, they're urging. Focus on the threat from Keir Starmer. And if you think, well, hang on a minute, the economy is not exactly strong ground for the Conservatives either, then absolutely, yes. But it is at least a matter which swing voters think is important. It would at least have him talking about matters which are important to them. Because for a very long time now, the Conservatives have been focusing on issues which are not only not part of people's everyday lives and concerns, not even that interesting to most people. Whereas Labour have been talking about the economy, about housing, the NHS jobs. They've been able to focus on individual policies, like recently dentistry, been able to get an NHS dentist. All Rishi Sunak has done You see how great things are. And there might be a few things that aren't terribly great, but don't worry, trust me, and they will be soon. But things aren't great. Nothing's great. Everything's worse, and noticeably worse. So according to this report, Sunak's advisors are now telling him he should face down the far right, not change his Rwanda bill significantly, get it out the way next week and then forget about it. Now, this would be good advice if he'd received it a year ago. But, well, more than a year ago now, I suppose. There are two massive problems which Sunak now faces. The first is that although people didn't care as much about asylum and immigration as the economy or healthcare, Conservative voters do now. I often refer to this polling in YouGov. It's very instructive. It tracks the most important issues facing the country according to voters. You can see that asylum and immigration has been raised in importance, and look where it happened. So it was languishing the doldrums, about 20%, along with loads of policies that about 20% of people think is a top issue. It was amongst them. It was mixed in with the environment and housing and all sorts, right? And then it began to rise in prominence from October 2022. That's when Rishi Sunak took over. He has directly fueled this increased focus on asylum. But you look at the chart and you think, well, it's still in third place behind healthcare and the economy. But this is for all voters. If you filter down to just Conservative voters, for them, it's now the top issue. The economy and healthcare, they're behind, significantly as well. That's a huge problem because it makes it very difficult to now just get the Rwanda plan through the Commons next week and then forget about it. Like, how does he now withdraw the oxygen from the asylum issue now that he's created it as it's a raging inferno now? Like, he had a chance when he first became Prime Minister. This was his chance at a reset. It was obvious that Sunak had been actively trying to become Prime Minister for a very long time before he actually did. So why didn't he have a plan? Where was his plan? Or if he had a plan, why didn't he have a good one? Second massive problem is that the far right are now very emboldened. Now, don't get me wrong. I remain to be convinced that they're ready to pounce. It's hard to be sure, but I think it's more realistic to suppose they realise they don't have enough time before the election now, so we'll focus on their takeover afterwards. Also, if they leave Sunak in place, it's easier to blame the upcoming election loss on the moderates in the party, or wets as they call them. If they take over, it's all their fault, right? But just because they probably won't depose him doesn't mean he can just face them down. Like, he had that option just over a year ago. I've said so many times how he could have done it relatively safely by isolating a few at a time and bringing them to heel. But he's shown himself to be spineless. He hid away when the Privileges Committee reports into Boris Johnson were being discussed and voted on in Parliament. He hid away during polling days for both of the major by-election dates last year. He's backed down on multiple manifesto promises because a few dozen Tory MPs bellyached about it, and he couldn't face them down. The idea that he can now face down a much larger and more emboldened faction of his party is laughable. His advisors should have been urging Sunak to do this from the start. Now, in theory, you could say, well, maybe they were and he just didn't listen and they're now just trying to urge him again. But if that's true, like if he didn't listen back then, when it was way easier to do, why would he now when it's actually very difficult? I think it's more likely this is new from his advisors. I've said before, I think they're basically useless. I think they're almost as inept as Sunak himself. They've been steering him wrong throughout last year. It's been embarrassing to watch at times as he attempted reset after reset, chasing after obviously shit strategies that he later had to abandon. The same article suggests that they think Sunak's only chance of avoiding a crushing defeat is getting inflation below 2% and growth going back upwards. But this is just more folly from advisors not worth the price of the taxi fare to Downing Street, much less their excessive salaries. First of all, this nonsense about getting inflation down isn't going to save them. Inflation fell more last year than it possibly could this year, and it didn't help the Tories in the polls. People don't care about the inflation or GDP figures. They don't care about a graph. They care about their own standard of living, and the Tories are crushing it. And this is how it works, because every time some economic metric does tick up, you would think to yourself, well, that's going to filter through and some people are going to benefit. It's like, but no, because the Tories use it as an excuse to squeeze people further. Like they're squeezing people now, right? And it's like, but they know they can't squeeze them too hard, so they just squeeze them a little bit. As soon as the economy improves, they go, oh, that gives us a scope to squeeze them some more. Like we saw it this winter, just as one little example. Because inflation was lower, they used that as an excuse to remove the energy support payments that people had the previous winter. So even though inflation was lower, people's standard of living did not improve because they, you know, as something might have given with one hand, they took it with another. Or I should say, probably it didn't improve for enough people, should we say. There were some people who will have benefited. Their focus should be on the feeling that key voters have about their quality of life, not isolated metrics. Like if I give someone £10 but then force them to give me £20 back, I'm not making them feel better, am I? You know, what this story shows is that Sunak's advisors have finally cottoned on to what the rest of us knew a long time ago, that the Rwanda plan is not a good source of votes. But they still don't fundamentally understand what is a good source of votes. They don't get voters. They're utterly clueless. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.